This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome into another episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined once again by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. And well, it's just about that time when the offseason officially wraps and the new season begins. We're getting very close to that for sure. And it's been a long offseason for sure. But with training camp just a couple of weeks away, we're going to put a wrap on the offseason by looking at all of the events of the offseason and breaking them down for you. So let's start off, guys. I'm going to kind of just give you a rundown of the moves that the Flyers made over the course of the offseason, because it was certainly still a busy offseason, even though there didn't seem like there was a whole lot on the to-do list, but there was certainly a lot on the list. So here we go. It started on June 9th. You got to remember, first couple months from the time the season ends into June, while the Stanley Cup playoffs are going on, really aren't that active for many teams because they're very limited on what they can do other than maybe re-signing their own players. So June 9th, first major move of the offseason, Shane Gostisbehere signs a 6-year, $27 million deal. June 16th, the Flyers traded Nick Cousins and prospect goalie Merrick Madsen to the Arizona Coyotes for Brendan Warren and a draft pick. On June 21st, Pierre-Edouard Bellemare gets selected in the expansion draft by the Vegas Golden Knights. Then draft weekend comes, a busy one. June 23rd, 24th, the Flyers take Nolan Patrick with the second overall pick. Later that night, they trade Brayden Schenn to the St. Louis Blues for Jori Lehtera, the 27th overall pick, which they used to select Morgan Frost, and a conditional first-round pick. And then drafted 7 more players in rounds 2 through 7. This included Isaac Ratcliffe, Matthew Strome, just a couple off the top. There's obviously a lot of players that come into the picture, but those were really the 2 headliners from day 2 of the draft weekend. June 29th, the Flyers re-signed Jordan Weal to a 2-year deal. July 1st, they re-signed Mike Vecchione to a 2-year deal and officially signed goalie Brian Elliott to a 2-year deal. July 11th, they re-signed Scott Lawton to a 2-year deal. July 13th, they re-signed Taylor Lear to a 1-year deal. And on July 15th, they rounded out their in-house signings by re-signing Anthony Stolarz, Alex Lyon, and Cole Bardreau. So guys, after going over the whole list here and listing out all the moves that the Flyers made in the offseason, what was the Flyers' best offseason move? Dan, why don't you start us off?
Well, I don't think there's any question about it that the best move, in my eyes, was the draft. You were able to get Nolan Patrick at the second spot, then trading up to get Morgan Frost and Isaac Ratcliffe. I feel those were 2 really good moves. I feel like Morgan Frost made that Brayden Schenn trade desirable. And then adding the sizable prospects, I said right before the draft show, during the draft show, that adding size was an organizational need. They did that with Ratcliffe and with Matthew Strome. But another great move was also the extension of Shane Gostisbehere. $4.5 million for 6 years is no bridge deal. There was a lot of contention as to what sort of deal he should get, whether it be a bridge deal or a long-term deal. It keeps Shane Gostisbehere on the Flyers for the foreseeable future. A valuable power play weapon at a reasonable price. $4.5 million is nothing to scoff at, but it's also nothing to worry about in terms of having a top 4 defenseman who can rush up the puck. He's only going to get better, Flyers fans would hope. And so even if, and the one con I guess people were looking at to signing him long term is what happens if the likes of Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, and Phil Myers surpass him. It doesn't matter, because as long as you have all those 4 and they all work out, you have a top 4 that can all push the puck up. So in my eyes, yeah, the draft is probably the best thing that Ron Hextall did all summer long. And then Shane Gostisbehere, keeping him, that's another great move.
Rob, what about you?
My 2 favorite moves that Ron Hextall and the Flyers made this offseason were kind of piggybacking off of Dan's point with the draft. I think it was the trade that sent Brayden Schenn to St. Louis for Jori Lehtera and 2 first-round picks, one of which was used on Morgan Frost. The other is a conditional pick. So I think that, while we're not exactly going to be mistaking Lehtera for Brayden Schenn out there next season. I mean, he does provide some depth. He's at least a serviceable option, but you're able to parlay Braden Shen into 2 first-round picks. And, I like what I've seen from Morgan Frost so far, at least on some of his tape. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on for the future. And the other move that I really liked was bringing in Brian Elliott. 2-year deal, $2.75 million. It's something where he's a veteran goaltender. He's been around the block. He's a guy that'll be a good mentor, at least for the younger goalies that are coming up the pipeline, especially if Anthony Stolarz figures to get called up or Alex Lyon gets called up this year. So Brian Elliott's a cagey guy. He's been around a long time, and it's a perfect bridge deal, I think. Especially when you look at the deal Steve Mason got to play for Winnipeg, where he's getting $4.1 million a season over a similar 2-year term. I think this is a no-brainer for the Flyers. I think Elliott's going to he may not exactly be the best net miner, especially if he's playing like he played in Calgary last season. But I think he can return to his form from St. Louis here in Philadelphia. I think that's a pretty good signing for the Flyers. I think those are the 2 best signings, at least 2 of my favorites from this season.
And I'm going to kind of piggyback off of both of you guys because, like both of you, I had 2 that really stood out to me. And one is for the short term and one is for the long term. The short term move to me that I liked the best was the re-signing of Jordan Wheel. To me, keeping Jordan Wheel around was a necessity for this team. He never really got his fair chance 2 seasons ago in 2015-16, and then emerged as one of the Flyers' more effective players, and quite honestly was a joy to watch down the stretch in a dismal season last season for the Flyers. Keeping him around, given his success at left wing, knowing it was one position where the Flyers didn't have much immediate depth, was huge to me. And I can't wait to see what he's capable of doing in a full 82-game season, not to mention that it was also, I thought, a very cost-effective deal. The 2-year, $3.5 million deal, 1.75 average annual. To me, that's a deal that will pay dividends a lot down the stretch as he starts to get more exposure and more regular playing time. Once he had it last year, you saw him run with it. As he does that through the course of a whole season next season, it'd be interesting to me to see if he can play up to that kind of worth. I think he can. I thought he would have played up to that kind of worth given the type of season he started to have at the end of last year. So if he can just simply replicate some of the consistency that he had down the stretch, he will easily, to me, make himself appear worthy of that kind of contract. The long-term answer to that question, though, is Nolan Patrick. Because years from now, if everything works out the way that it should, or is at least expected to, and don't get me wrong, things change over the course of time. Sometimes things never go as they're expected to. But if he turns out to be the type of player that he's projected to be, or even kind of gets into the same ballpark as the projections, then drafting Nolan Patrick could certainly be a franchise-defining move. It's way too soon to look at the offseason right now and say that the selection of Nolan Patrick will have an immediate impact. Quite honestly, we don't know that. The hope is that he makes the team out of camp this year, but we've got to get through that camp and see if he really can make the team immediately in his draft year, or if there is one more season of juniors for him. It's still a possibility, and we can't take that for granted until Ron Hextall says, yes, Nolan Patrick is a member of the Philadelphia Flyers on their 2017-18 roster. But in a few years' time, if the timeline projects as it figures to, then adding Nolan Patrick will be the move that this offseason is remembered for over everything.
I have to agree with you in terms of the Jordan Wheel deal being good for the Flyers. One thing that I do like about it too is that it gives the Flyers options at forward. If a veteran isn't pulling his weight like Matt Reed, like Dale Weiss, he can easily just be a scratch, and you don't miss a beat. You're not bringing up an AHL caliber forward to take anybody's place. You have Jordan Wheel right there. You have the possibility of having Oscar Lindblom come up. You have the possibility of Nolan Patrick being in the lineup. So that way, it kind of forces some of the potential dead weight out of the lineup, and you get some younger players, some players with a little bit more potential into the lineup as well.
Yeah, and Dan, I have to agree with your take on the Shane Gostisbehere signing, because as the offseason progressed, didn't you notice that other free agent defensemen who were in the same position that Gostisbehere and the Flyers were, still restricted free agents, still having time to work out a deal with the team that they debuted with, but at the same time, the numbers just kept getting higher. You started to see, even at $4.5 million, yes, if he only projects out to be a top 4 defenseman and is the 4th on the list when all of these other defensemen come up and all is said and done with the development of all of these prospects, it's still going to be a very cost-effective move given the way that everything inflated after that deal. It was amazing to see how at that time you had this deal. It seemed very cost-effective then, and then it became even more cost-effective as you saw other defensemen making similar or more money by the year as they got their deals.
And it's very vital in the NHL right now to have 4 defensemen that can move the puck and be solid defensively. The Flyers will have that with Ivan Provorov. The hope is that Shane Gostisbehere gets a little bit better on the defensive end, and then he can round that out for the Flyers. And then Travis Sanheim is probably one of the likely candidates to make the Flyers with those 2 opening spots on the blue line. So right then and there, you could have 3 puck-rushing defensemen, and then you just wait for somebody else, maybe like Phil Myers, in the next couple of years to take that spot as well. It's that's how you build a winner in today's NHL, and the Flyers definitely guaranteed at least 2 puck-rushing defensemen, because Provorov should not be going anywhere for a long time to come with Shane Gostisbehere, because there's a lot of talk from some reactionary fans, some talk that he should be traded if they're not going to play him. With this deal, he could still be traded, but it doesn't seem like that's something that's on the Flyers' radar with that type of deal.
Yeah, I thought right away, as soon as they kind of skipped the bridge deal and went straight to something more long-term, like 6 years, that was a message that said he's a part of the future. So I don't see anything changing with that. I think that I liked what I heard from Gostisbehere over the last few weeks. You know, as he did the charity event in Jersey and things like that, and was talking about how he finally got to go through, or the way that he got to go through this offseason, and how he's feeling good again, and he's stronger, and he said he has no excuses, you know. So I think that last year was a perspective year for him, even as a second-year player. It was just a way of taking all the success in the world in your rookie season and finding out that there's peaks and valleys, and I think that this season you're going to see more of a return to form for him. It's going to be tough at times because, let's not kid ourselves here, the Flyers are going to open up spots to young defensemen, and it's going to make things an adventure at times. But I don't think that he's going to be near as much of a liability offensively as he was at times last season, because there were times where he just did not look as effective as he did in his rookie season. I don't think that's going to be the case at all this year.
He was actually pretty good in terms of preventing zone entries and getting the puck up ice. So if he can be even better, if that's considered a down year for Shane Gostisbehere, then there's nothing really to worry about with the guy. It's going to be very important for him next year to be stable, because as you just mentioned, there'll be 2 rookie defensemen on this team. There'll be Ivan Provorov with. Is he going to have a sophomore slump? You don't know, but he will still be a second-year pro. He'll still need somebody for guidance, and their veteran presence is not all that great. Brandon Manning is a 7th defenseman at best. Radko Gudas he's a solid defenseman, but he's not great at getting the puck up ice. He's a little bit better at preventing zone entries, but take that for what it is. And then you have Andrew McDonald, who is not great at much. So it's really going to be Shane Gostisbehere who's got to set the example. And I think when you have a season like he did, never again is a great motivating factor. So he's not going to allow himself to have that type of season again. He's not going to let himself get down on himself again. And if I'm right about that, then there's nothing to worry about with Shane Gostisbehere for a long, long time.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that too. Yeah, I mean, eventually it was funny because they were doing the 31 and 31 on NHL.com, and I saw them talk about how Gostisbehere is going to be, essentially, he's a veteran of the blue line, being even just his 3rd season. He's a veteran of the blue line because there's only 2 other defensemen on the team, essentially, who have more experience than he does, who are going to be regulars. Brandon Manning has played a lot over the course of the last 3 years, but that was more by virtue of injury and being a guy who was there and durable and able to step in and do a decent job of filling in for the players he was replacing, but he's never factored into that top 6 picture. So it really has been, you talk about the other 2 being the veterans, that makes the next highest player in experience Gostisbehere, even in his 3rd season. So to take that kind of attitude, I think, says a lot, too. I think we do look at Ivan Provorov and think, what a mature player. And especially after the way that he just grew over the course of his rookie season. There's always going to be worries about sophomore slumps with players like that. I don't see him having a major one. I see him having the same kind of peaks and valleys. I think he can work himself out of the peaks or out of the valleys a lot faster than Gostisbehere did last season. And that's mainly, I think, all you can hope for is that they're going to happen, but how quickly can you get yourself out of those down periods? And I think Provorov's going to be able to do it very effectively and very quickly. And then if Gostisbehere has that bounce-back season that he's determined to have, that's going to be a very good 1-2 punch to have because there's already going to be excitement generated by whoever comes into those supposedly two slots available for rookie defensemen. So it's going to create even more excitement knowing that you've got a player who's determined to have a better year than he did in his second NHL season. You've got a guy who has all the look and feel of a number one defenseman in just his second year, but he had that look as a rookie. So what does year two say? That's why people are so excited about this defensive core. It doesn't mean that that's going to happen, or it doesn't mean it's going to take effect next season and be a great defensive group, but it's going to have the potential to be one as these other players mature and as you see roles change as they get more mature and get more experience.
It came very naturally in Shane Gostisbehere's rookie season. Everything, like the bounces, the goals, the success, and last season was just something of a wake up call. It was like the NHL isn't easy, kid. This is going to take a little bit more work. Not everything's going to go your way, and the coach is not going to see everything your way. So you got just like you were saying, Kevin, with Ivan Provorov. It's a little bit different with Provorov, though, because everything didn't go his way, like that game in Chicago very early in the season. It's something that he had to naturally grow out of. So much to your point, when he works himself out of those valleys, he already has experience in doing that. So the only thing that really could hold him down is if he gets into a valley early and just stays in the valley. But with his calm demeanor, you would hope that it wouldn't happen, but you never know until the kid hits that valley and then has to climb out of it.
Honestly, when it comes down to it, as far as a sophomore slump for Provorov, I've pretty much been budgeting for that this season. I just figured it's one of those things that's expected to happen, especially as people get a little bit more tape on him and people kind of figure out more the game that he plays. He might struggle a little bit this season. I'm completely expecting that to happen. It's, as you mentioned, he had a lot going for him last season, and, that was he really was incredible, and he really did bounce back from that game in Chicago, that third game of the season. But as far as the sophomore slump is concerned, I'm entirely expecting it. It's just one of those things that happens, and it's a very common thing. It happens to just about everybody. The most prolific of second-year players go through it. It's something that we're pretty much. It almost, I don't want to say it's inevitable, but it almost comes off that way.
Yeah, I want to touch on what you just said, Rob, because you hit the nail on the head to me in comparing Gostisbehere's situation to what's got the potential to get to Provorov, too. It's teams were able to start game planning for Shane Gostisbehere in year two. Once the whole idea, okay, power play specialist, we got you now, we know where the shot's coming from. We're going to game plan against that and not give you that shot. And what does it do? It disrupts the entire flow of the power play sometimes. That's why when we talked about Chris Knobloch coming in as an assistant coach and working the power play, when we talked about that a little while ago, that's why that's such a big deal. You need to make adjustments when teams game plan for you one way and aren't expecting something a different way. So, yeah, Provorov's going to have to go through the same kind of thing to some extent. I think Provorov being more of a well-rounded player already, we knew Gostisbehere was not going to be the greatest player in the defensive zone from the start. He got a little bit better over the course of that rookie season. And then last season we kind of just, like we said, it was peaks and valleys, and it took a while for him to get out of some of those valleys, especially as players learned and opposing teams learned where the weaknesses were and how to attack the weaknesses. In Provorov's case, I think it's a little bit more difficult to identify the weaknesses because he is more of a well-rounded player, and then I think he adjusts very well. So I'm with you, Rob, in the sense that he's a second-year player. All of the best are going to have that stretch where 2, 3 games, 4 games go by, you're going to be sitting there going, we don't know what's going on with Ivan Provorov. He's clearly in a bit of a slump. But at the same time, how quickly you can limit that to 2 or 3 or 4 games. It's when it turns into a 10-game stretch where you can't figure out what's wrong with this guy that it becomes a problem.
It's practical to hope for the best and expect the worst with Provorov next season. But if you're going to do that, then I think that the expectation for Shane Gostisbehere should be a breakout season, because it's usually in that third season where young players hit their stride. That rookie season, they'll have a really good season sometimes. That second season, they'll hit the schneid, the sophomore slump, and in the third season, that's when they become maybe not an elite player, but that's where they become the great player that they're going to be. So if you're going to have that expectation for Shane Gostisbehere this season, then it's going to have to happen in the third season. It doesn't have to happen, but that's what you should be expecting.
Absolutely. All right, so we've reviewed the offseason timeline and talked about the best moves of the offseason. So what about the worst? We will have that for you when we return here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast.
You are listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
Back here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast, and after taking a look at all of the Flyers' offseason moves and choosing the ones that we thought were the best, which offseason move by the Flyers was the worst? Rob, why don't you go ahead and lead us off this time?
Well, it's not exactly as cut and dry as it was last offseason, where I can just easily look at the Dale Weiss signing and be like, that's the worst, that's the worst. And I guess maybe you could almost say the worst part of this offseason was just finding a way to not package him off to the sun or something like that, or whatever the hell. But I think that when it comes down to it, I don't know that you can really point to a worst move, rather, for the Flyers this offseason. You know, I think that they've had a pretty decent offseason. We discussed that, but I think that maybe the things, I guess, that baffled me the most, I guess I'll go with, are the one trade from the 7th round of the draft where they swapped seventh round picks with Montreal. I didn't really understand that, just more or less because is it just there was nobody else on their draft board or something, nobody else that really stood out to them, so they figured they can just take the pick for next year. I mean, that's probably the best way to make sense of what happened. And I was also kind of expecting something when there was all the flurry about the expansion draft and protecting names for the expansion draft. I was expecting maybe something to go on with Las Vegas, maybe a sign-in trade or something. Like when they protected Scott Lawton, for example, I thought maybe there was a way they could force a sign-in trade with Lawton, work something out with the Golden Knights or anything like that. Or I was almost expecting Michael Neuwirth to go over there as well. But when you look at it, they've got Marc-Andre Fleury, who they're basically hitching their wagons to. He's basically expected to sell hockey in Vegas. And you have Calvin Pickard, who's coming off a horrendous year in Colorado behind him. So I guess it's something where there was just no way they were able to work something out, and especially because of the connection between their GM, George McPhee, and Neuwirth from their respective times in Washington. I thought something was going to go down on that front. So I think that maybe there was just they didn't do as much as they probably could have as far as a sign-in trade or something with the Golden Knights.
Dan, what about you?
Well, I'm going to have to disagree with Rob's best moves, because my worst move is the signing of Brian Elliott. Now I know this is it was a very weak goaltending class, and you didn't have too many guys to go on. Elliott is very capable of playing well. He had a phenomenal save percentage 2 years ago, but that was not with this Flyers team, and it was not last year. It was with the St. Louis Blues and a defensive system taught by Ken Hitchcock, who is notorious for being able to make teams into very good defensive teams. He's going to face similar defensive inconsistencies with the Flyers that he struggled with in Calgary. And what I was doing earlier in the offseason, I took a look at 10 free agent goaltenders, the ones that could be intriguing to the Flyers. And what I found with Brian Elliott is he had the 8th lowest low danger save percentage out of all of them, and then 9th in high danger save percentage. So he was one of the worst goaltenders in stopping the stoppable shots. and one of the worst in stopping the not stoppable shots. So what you're going to get with that is a goaltender who's going to give up weak goals, and a goaltender that's not going to keep you in games by making game-breaking saves. He's going to be with a lot of young defensemen, and the thing that worries me about that is if he gives up those weak goals, that can affect their confidence. That they're going to have to think that they're going to have to play perfect right out of the gate, and that's not the way you want young players to develop. You want them to be able to learn from their mistakes and not think that they made a mistake when it was just a veteran goaltender who's prone to giving up weak goals is the one that's making the mistake. And my second worst move is taking on Jori Lehtera. Now, the trade itself is good because they got 2 first-round picks, and not a lot of people were in love with Braden Shen, even though he's a 55 to 59 point producer. But when you take on Jori Lehtera, you have a guy that was sheltered in St. Louis. He had 343 offensive zone starts versus 186 defensive zone starts. So this is not a guy that's going to replace Pierre-Edouard Bellemare. He only scored 7 goals, 6 at even strength. So he's not that much. That's not that much of an improvement over what Braden Shen was producing at even strength. And as a fourth-line center, he's expensive, and he's still got 2 years left on his deal. So it's not like somebody like Valtteri Filppula, who's got 1 more year, and if he doesn't produce, he doesn't produce. It's a low-risk, high-reward type of thing. This has a potential to kind of be a dead weight on the team for not only this season, but next season as well.
So I'm going to kind of comment on both of what you guys said first, and then I'll get into mine, because there's an element that I agree with Rob that I didn't see a glaring bad move by the Flyers. To kind of, and this is why I'm going to piggyback off of Dan's point, the Brian Elliott signing to me was not the best, not the worst. I was not as high on that move when it was reported to be a 3-year deal. When they took 1 year off and made it 2, I saw some logic behind it because of the fact that it set a timeline to me with Neuvirth having the same length contract that Elliott did, that now you have 2 years to figure this out and figure out who emerges prospect-wise as your leading goalie to get him to the NHL. And to me, that made some sense. I didn't really account for the Lehtera move because of the fact that I packaged it in with the whole deal. So in other words, by looking at Lehtera as part of a deal where you acquired 2 first-round picks, even for Braden Shen, and while losing Braden Shen hurts you scoring-wise, especially on the power play, early, I didn't think that was horrible because getting first-round picks is obviously a good thing. They got, by all accounts, it seems to be a player who will be on the rise in Morgan Frost. So you go, okay, that makes some sense. You got a good prospect out of that. You have another potential prospect coming with another first-round pick somewhere down the road. And Lehtera was the throw-in. Yeah, that's not a great thing. The contract is horrible, but that is what it is. For me, the move that and again, I don't want to call it a worst move because I don't consider it a bad decision, but Rob hinted at it a little bit, and to me, I found it just baffling. And that is the re-signing of Scott Laughton. I don't want to give up on Scott Laughton, but I'm struggling to find where he truly fits on this team anymore. The Flyers have cleared roster spots, sure, but there was a difference between doing that for players in the system before this draft and after. Before this draft was a totally different picture. When Nolan Patrick came into the picture and the rise of Oscar Lindblom in the last year and adding prospects like Morgan Frost and Isaac Ratcliffe, and even the way that Yerman Rubtsov has been playing and progressed, eventually, if Laughton doesn't become a part of the top 9 discussion among forwards relatively quickly, he's going to be expendable the same way that Nick Cousins was. So I start to wonder if Laughton even sees year 2 of this contract. And this is where I'm trying to go with this. He was a restricted free agent, so I get re-signing him. But at the same time, I don't get why it was more than a 1-year deal. To see if he somehow is good enough to get among those forwards in the system, to first of all, to even break into the Flyers lineup, or if he ends up falling behind even the prospects that are coming up, or just gets lost in the shuffle. You don't ever want to give up on a former first-round pick, but it feels like the Flyers are getting very close to that with Laughton. So to me, giving him 2 years to find out what he really would have needed to prove in one just doesn't make any sense to me. And you have him on the books for that potentially. So I'm just curious as to how that's going to play out, because I don't even know where Scott Lawton necessarily fits on this year's team, at least to guarantee it, because there's too many moving parts right now. There's too many moving parts with Nolan Patrick, with Oscar Lindblom. Where are they all going to go? Latera's probably going to be centering the fourth line, we think, but you don't know. You've got Matt Reed, you've got Michael Raffl, you got all these bottom six forwards all over the place. So where does Scott Lawton fit in this picture? And then how, if he doesn't really fit in the picture even now, then what are you going to learn about him in another year or two that you don't know now? You're not going to learn anything other than that he's been a really good player with the Lehigh Valley Phantoms.
I think the important thing with the Scott Lawton signing was just protecting an asset. Even if he isn't on the roster this season, somebody somewhere at some point is going to value him because he's a first round pick. He has potential, and not every team in the NHL has, I don't want to call it depth because it makes it seem like the Flyers are loaded at forward, but because they're really not. They have a logjam, but who's to say that it's great? But they have a number of forwards, and other teams don't have a lot of depth at forward. So they might value him a little bit more than what the Flyers might. So you might be able to squeeze a couple picks, maybe not high picks, but you might be able to squeeze something out of him if you can trade him to, a team that needs forwards. Detroit is in a windfall of losing players. They might even lose Athanasiou to the KHL, so they might value him. It's about just maintaining your assets and seeing what you can get for him, even if he doesn't play to the level like you mentioned, Kevin. If he's not, if he doesn't get through this logjam, because there's players that could easily squeeze him out, like Nolan Patrick, like Oscar Lindblom. And just to respond to what Rob felt was a bad move, the 7th for 7th, it's if you don't like where you're at with the draft, if you don't like anybody left, if there's nobody left on your board and there's nobody you're really crazy about, I like the idea of trading out of a draft and going to the next year's draft, because there might be somebody you like at that point. Or you could just keep trading out of drafts until eventually you find that guy in the 7th round that you actually do like and you're willing to trade your pick for him, essentially. It's more, I don't know, it's more of a conservative approach. It's more of a cautionary approach. Don't waste a pick if you can just get another pick for the next year. I didn't mind either one of those moves. They're just, it's just kind of playing towards the next season and see if Scott Lawton can push, because Ron Hextall loves competition. Let's see if he can push the Yor Lateras, the Matt Reeds, the Michael Raffles, and see maybe he'll make Matt Reed expendable. Maybe he'll make Michael Raffl expendable. Michael Raffl, please, can definitely get traded.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. You've got two forwards that are part of this logjam that we're talking about who are down to the last year of their contracts. That would be Reed and Filppula. So is there room for Lawton in year two? Probably a little bit more, but at the same time, when I say getting lost in the shuffle too, it's not just among the guys like Nolan Patrick, Oscar Lindblom, and Latera and Raffl, who are all figuring to be part of this year's Flyers roster as it is. But I'm also talking about, what if in another year you come back and we're talking about, let's say a year from right now as we're getting ready for the 2018-19 season, what if Yerman Rubtsov's close to being ready and there's another center who is now trying to figure his way into the picture, and somebody comes out of the picture like a Filppula or a Matt Reed or something like that, and that's the roster spot that Rubtsov could fill or something like that. If he proves to be ready and he finds a way to be better than Lawton is, then to me, I don't get burying him in the AHL for 2 years, if that's what it comes to. If they do
that's
it
when you
year,
trade him.
Exactly. And that's why I said that's why I threw Nick Cousins into the discussion. Because Nick Cousins to me was a fine depth player, but at the same time, good luck cracking the bottom six of this team sometimes, because they were all on such an even playing field sometimes. It's hard to determine which guy is truly better than the other because of the fact that they would all have their peaks and valleys at different times. So you'd go, Michael Raffl's not a healthy scratch this time because he's on a good stretch, but Matt Reed's not, so we're going to scratch him tonight. And then Matt Reed's in a little bit of a better spot, so Scott Lawton's getting the scratch tonight, or Nick Cousins is getting the scratch tonight. And after a while, it's too much of a carousel, merry-go-round, hop on, hop off kind of thing that it becomes too much. So that's why I put Nick Cousins in there, because obviously after a while, the Flyers had to make some of these bottom 6 players expendable. You can't have that much of a logjam and expect to open up roster spots for other players. And I think they're well aware of that. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. And I do like what you said too, Dan, about the thing with the draft picks too. Yeah, it's at time, in the moment, it's a little confusing because you're going, what the hell's the difference? Okay, 7th round this year for 7th round next year. What the hell does that matter? It doesn't make any difference. But at the same time, I look at the way the Flyers made moves early in the draft that made that move possible later in the draft. You got aggressive early. Ron Hextall got very aggressive in trading back into the first round to get Morgan Frost, and he got aggressive again in trading up in the second round to get Isaac Ratcliffe. Those are 2 moves to me that said that's when we're going for it. And look at the way that was rated. You get Nolan Patrick, Morgan Frost, and Isaac Ratcliffe, and people are coming back and grading the draft at that point and going, those are 3 top 30 players. They all could have been first rounders to some people. And you're going, wow, now that was a way to get aggressive. That was a reason to get aggressive and make those moves in that case. So if in the 7th round, if you just don't feel like you have anything, or you just want to move the pick to try to give, maybe somebody else is offering you something. And I know it was just a pick swap. But maybe they're offering it to you because of the fact that they go, we know we may not need that pick in the 7th, like Montreal. We may not need that pick in the 7th round next year in order to jump up and get somebody who we saw on our board who we want that nobody else may want. That's how those trades work out. I like the fact that when you countered that with, look at the 2 aggressive moves that were made in the 1st and 2nd round, and that to me makes that, it rounds out the draft much better in my opinion. So that is the best and worst of the offseason, at least to us. And again, we talk about this on several different shows. We've said this. Feel free to agree, disagree, tell us where we went wrong. Maybe we have the totally wrong view on what was the worst move of the offseason. Maybe we're wrong on the best move of the offseason. Maybe me calling Nolan Patrick a long-term best move of the offseason is just ridiculous because short-term is what it is. Go ahead and tell us. But we are going to, when we come back, we're going to take a look at the Flyers offseason as a whole and see how well they addressed team needs this offseason. So stick around. We'll be right back on the Flyerdelphia Podcast.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
Back here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast, and the Flyers had several needs going into this offseason. So, did the Flyers address those needs effectively in this offseason? Rob, we'll start with you again on this one.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, there weren't a whole lot of needs for the Flyers to address, with the exception of goaltending, which, they did, which proved to be a very divisive topic. I appreciate that, but bringing in Brian Elliott over Steve Mason just because it was something where, that needed to be done. But the Flyers are at that point in their rebuild where they're looking to transition to a lot more of the younger guys. So they're just kind of, filling out space for the most part wherever they can. And, I think that one of their big things was they also were putting an emphasis on the Lehigh Valley Phantoms and trying to get them back into the Calder Cup playoffs and maybe trying to get a little bit of a run for them as well. But I think for the most part, there's not a whole lot left over for the Flyers. There's not a lot of their needs are for the most part addressed. I think there's really nothing that they really missed out on. Nothing. They pretty much Ron Hextall checked off his off-season to-do list pretty early and pretty much wrapped all that up in pretty quick order, pretty seamlessly, pretty painlessly. And, for the most part, I think everything's all squared away.
Dan, what about you?
Well, when it comes down to their needs, I'm going to have to think in terms of the short term. And so goaltending was definitely addressed. The free agency market was not great, so therefore it's not solved, but it was addressed. Brian Elliott is going to come in. He's going to be the starting goaltender, and what he does from there is totally up to Brian Elliott. Goal scoring was definitely a problem last season. That was not addressed. They traded Braden Shen for Yori Laterra. That makes the Flyers weaker offensively. But the hope is that with the likes of Travis Konechny, potentially Oscar Lindblom, potentially Nolan Patrick, that those players will evolve and develop into players that will bring the offense to heights that Braden Shen by himself could not bring the Flyers offense. And they definitely need defensive help. That wasn't addressed either. Again, the hope is that somebody like Sanheim, Hag, Moran, Myers, somebody will come in, and two of those players at least will come in and fill the slots and maybe solidify the defense, but that's hard for a rookie to do, two rookies to do. So there were, the team is largely stuck with defensemen, as I said in the last segment, that, they're bad at preventing zone entries. They're bad at getting the puck up, maybe either one except for Gostisbehere and Provorov. And when the vets are bad at defending the blue line, that puts a lot of pressure on those two young players. You don't know how they're going to respond. I would have liked for the Flyers to try to move one of those, let's use the term bad. I don't like calling any professional athlete bad because they're better than me. They can run me through the wall. But if they got Andrei Markov or even Cody Franzen, that would have been an improvement over McDonald, Manning, or Gudis. Both are really good at preventing zone entries. Both are really good at getting the puck up the ice. And if you want to have defensemen that can do that, you might want to have some vets that can teach them how to do it. Radko Gudis isn't teaching anybody how to push the puck up ice. Brandon Manning isn't teaching anyone how to do anything other than be a reserve defenseman. And Andrew McDonald is probably going to weaken your development unless, like we said a couple shows ago, Kevin, unless you're going by all right, well, he's the dead weight, and we're just going to Ivan Provorov the situation, and hopefully they learn from that. So in terms of addressing all of their needs, the Flyers didn't do that, but they're playing the waiting game with their prospects, so maybe they didn't have to do that with everything. I would have liked them to see it. I would have liked for them to have added at least one defenseman at the expense of another veteran defenseman, not the two rookies, though.
Yeah, my answer to this question, did the Flyers address their needs, is they did the best they could. I say that because we won't fully know how the Flyers addressed their needs until the regular season begins and the final roster is unveiled, given the fact that, to me, looking at like goal scoring could be better on the Flyers next season with Oscar Lindblom on the team, maybe with Nolan Patrick on the team. Those are players that certainly have high potential and high expectations for being players who should put the puck in the net. The thing about that is that until we know that they're definitively on the roster, we can't talk about it like that. We have to assume that the Flyers still have a hole there because of the fact that as easily as Lindblom and Patrick could be on the team and making up for a void in goal scoring, it could be Michael Raffl and Matt Reed getting extended playing time in those same slots. You never know. And in that case, I don't want to call the need addressed until I see that they've officially made a roster. So that being said, I want to see how they round out the forward group first and foremost. But the thing that I thought the Flyers did a solid job this offseason of, to an extent, was shedding more of the dead weight. Not all of it yet, obviously, but more of the dead weight off. Because one thing I didn't mention when we went over the offseason moves at the very top of the show was just a few of the other departures from the team. And among the likes of them, because we mentioned Pierre-Edouard Bellemare getting picked up in the expansion draft, and we mentioned the trade that sent Braden Shen to St. Louis, and the trade that sent Nick Cousins and Merrick Madsen to Arizona. The other players that also are not returning to the team that we didn't mention, Chris Van de Velde, Michael Del Zotto, Nick Schultz. We did talk about Steve Mason briefly, Roman Lyubimov, Boyd Gordon, guys like that. So to me, I sit there and I go, opening up spots for rookies in place of Del Zotto and Schultz is eventually going to be a need checked off. You needed to open up spots somehow. You just chose, and it was as simple as choosing not to bring players like that back. That's the thing. So when I look at, and that's what I'm saying, when I look at the list of departures from this team, probably with the exception of Shen, and that's also a short-term thing, mind you, I don't see a player who could have easily been replaced, or who couldn't have easily been replaced. Replacing Braden Shen in the short term is certainly a daunting task, because essentially, and we talked about this coming out of the draft show once Nolan Patrick was officially selected and the trade had gone down, That puts a lot on the shoulders of guys like Nolan Patrick and Oscar Lindblom to sit there and say that if you're on the team next year, essentially you're accounting for the 25 goals, including 17 on the power play that Braden Shen scored. That's asking a lot of two rookies. So, but otherwise, who on this team couldn't replace Chris Vandevelde? Who couldn't replace what Nick Schultz did last year? That's not impossible. So I look at that and I go, with the shift to bringing on younger talent, if that was the goal to fill any needs, then I think the Flyers did that well by opening up spots. There's forward spots available, there's defensive spots available, and then knowing the way the goalie situation was, as I mentioned in the last part, 2 years for Brian Elliott with Michael Neuvirth's 2 years sets up a chance for one of the prospect goalies to jump in actually as soon as next season, really, because with 1 season left on either contract, they can become much more expendable. And then, but definitely within 2 seasons, you're talking about somebody, one of these prospect goalies, and for sake of argument, since we've talked about these prospects several times over, you're going to assume it's one of Carter Hart or Felix Sandstrom, at least for right now. That's where that void will come from. The thing about answering the question, did the Flyers address their needs, is that it couldn't be completely answered this offseason. They were going to have to start to bridge the gap between shedding dead weight and bringing in younger talent, and they've done that. So to me, they've addressed some of the needs. It doesn't mean they've come close to completely solving the puzzle yet of putting together a contending team. Far from it, in fact. And really, their success next season hinges on what these rookie players give the Flyers as early as they can. Because, you know, if you sit through another long October, you're done for, and you pretty much can tell. You know, if you get to Thanksgiving the way the Flyers got to Thanksgiving last year, with the exception of, you know, the 10-game winning streak that followed right after, the Flyers looked like they were already dead in the water when Thanksgiving rolled around, and then started that 10-game winning streak the Sunday after. You know, and that picked up from there. And for a little stretch through the middle of December, they looked like they could have been a playoff team. You know, and that's the thing. They're already so close to being one or the other as it is at times, that it all depends on what the younger talent does this upcoming season. And that doesn't just go for rookie players like Lindblom, Patrick, and whoever's defensively, whether it's Sanheim, you know, the outside shot that it's Myers, Sam Moran, Robert Haig, guys like that. It's more or less also on the players like Ivan Provorov, Travis Konechny, Shane Gostisbehere. Across the board, they're still, any player really who has less than 5 years experience falls into that category of being a player that's going to be a catalyst for where this team goes next year and then beyond as well.
Yeah, the question lends itself to the short term, and that's why I had to think in that term. And this is not a team that's built for the short term. It's a team that's supposed to either, you know, just survive in the short term, just, you know, barely make it to the playoffs if they can do that, or, you know, just, you know, transition to the better times. But in terms of, you know, this season, for the 2017-18 season, this team is not, I mean, it could be considered slightly better because of losing that dead weight, of getting rid of Michael Del Zotto, letting Chris Vandevelde walk, and bringing in young players who could potentially be better. It's hard not to get, it would be hard not to be better. But by losing Braden Shen, you're much weaker on the power play, a little bit weaker even strength offensively. And the players you got to replace them, are they better? You can say that Jordan Weal is a replacement for Braden Shen because he's going to be a top 6, top 9 forward, and Yuri Laterra is not. But there's no guarantee that Jordan Weal is going to be the type of player the Flyers need him to be to replace Braden Shen. Shen is a 55 to 59 point producer, and there was only a small sample of what Jordan Weal did last season. So it might have to be a committee, and times have shown that if you try to get offense through a committee to replace one player, you're not in a great spot.
Yeah, and that's the way I saw it too when Shen was traded. You know, my first reaction to that was that it really does hurt the Flyers in the short term, because of the fact that you just don't ask one player, especially any rookie, to come up and become a 25 goal scorer. That just doesn't happen, you know. So the fact that we don't know who's going to replace that immediately, we can sit here. I think Danny made a good point. We know Jordan Weal is going to be on the roster in some capacity and probably in that top 9, if not higher, then, what about the others, though? We don't know the other pieces of that committee yet. We don't know that Lindblom's making the team. We don't know that Patrick's making the team. It's a difficult thing to evaluate because of the fact that since we don't know, you're stuck playing a guessing game almost until the end of September. Are they, aren't they? And until you know for sure, my hope would be that they do, just because of the fact that given the way that the offseason has progressed and the fact that the outlook on this upcoming season isn't overwhelming, they have an outside shot to be a playoff team because, hell, they could back their way into it again just like they did 2 years ago. You never know. But if it's going to be the other way around and they're going to be either just short or too many shortcomings that don't allow them to make the playoffs, I'd love to see Nolan Patrick get his feet wet in a year like that. I'd love to see Oskar Lindblom get his feet wet in a year like that and just see what they can produce. I'd love to see Nolan Patrick and Oskar Lindblom each be 15 goal scorers maybe, Can they get 15, out of 82 games? I'd like to see them try to do that, or at least 10 even, something like that. Let's just see where it goes from there and how it builds over the course of time and see if they can be those 50 to 50, in that 50-59 point range that you're talking about, that Braden Shen was, because if you can build that up over the course of time, they'll just be even better as you hit that point where you're starting to move into contention. So now that we've covered all the angles and aspects of the Flyers offseason, we will give our final assessment on the offseason when we return here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast. Stay with us.
You're listening to the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin, Rob, and Dan on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
Back here on the Flyerdelphia Podcast, and now that we've looked at all aspects of the Flyers offseason, it's time to give our final assessment and our final thoughts on the offseason. So guys, let's kind of go into sort of like grading mode here without really putting a grade on it, but still your final evaluations. And how would you guys overall assess the Flyers offseason? This would be draft, free agency, internal moves, the whole nine. So Dan, why don't you lead us off there?
Well, I feel like the draft really pulls this offseason up. There was a lot of great moves made at the draft, even though I'm not a big fan of bringing on Jori Lehtera. Adding 2 first-round picks is great. Nolan Patrick has the potential to be a first-line center for the Flyers for years to come. Morgan Frost has the potential to be a very sneaky playmaker for the Flyers in a few seasons when he develops. They added size in terms of the organization, which they desperately needed. But in the terms of the short term, like I said in the prior segment, Shen for Lehtera, Elliott for Mason, these aren't improvements. So it's going to be a rough haul if that's what you're dependent on. But that's not what the Flyers are dependent on. They're dependent on these young players that we don't know if they're going to make the team yet, but some of them are. And if they don't, especially the Nolan Patricks and the Oskar Lindbloms, if they don't make the team, this is a very average forward core. It is not great. It's not going to get them. It's not going to cure their goal scoring woes. And then on defense, Travis Sanheim has the potential to really turn this core into something completely different, but you don't know if he's going to make the team. It could be Sam Moran. It could be Robert Hagg. So it's hard to grade the offseason in terms of that when you, like you said in the prior segment, Kevin, when you don't know who's going to make the team yet. So it's just when it's all based on a young player developing like Travis Konechny, you don't know how he's going to respond to a difficult rookie season. You don't know if Nolan Patrick's going to be around, if Oskar Lindblom is going to be around. They could improve the offense. They can improve the potentiality of this team being better this season right now, but there's no way to really know about it. So I can't really grade it, but I know that the draft in the future looks great for the Flyers. It's just the short-term deals I don't think is going to work out in the Flyers' favor for this particular season.
All right. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I think when it comes down to evaluating the Flyers offseason, it's pretty much well known by this point that their goal is basically just to further the rebuild along, and Hextall's keeping his stamp on the team. And I think it's something where they're doing what they can, and obviously they're pretty much relying on these younger talents to come up and be able to kind of carve themselves up, especially when you look at how young the blue line's going to be if guys like Robert Haig, Sam Moran, or Travis Sanheim or Phil Myers are able to make the jump, or you're pretty much just continuing and seeing the rebuild progress at this point, and that's pretty much what this offseason seems like it was for. And I think Dan, I think what you brought up earlier, one name you brought up, I actually had him written down, was Cody Franson. Who's a guy who, because you were talking about the lack of veteran depth on the blue line. Granted, you have guys like Andrew McDonald and Radko Gudas and Brandon Manning, who they're vets, you can go ahead and say, but when it comes down to it, it's not like they're going to be able to teach anybody much. And maybe Cody Franson's a guy who could make sense on a PTO deal or something like that. Or I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you guys remember a few years back when the Flyers brought in Carlo Koliakovo after the first month of the season, just because things weren't exactly working out on the blue line. If you bring up Haig and Moran, or somebody gets hurt, or things just aren't going as planned, and you have to bring in that veteran presence, that's something I think that could work out. So I think when it comes down to it, that the Flyers did what they could this offseason. Then they're, especially with the draft. I mean, make no mistake. I mean, the draft was a home run. There's no denying that. But I think in that regard, the Flyers had a pretty decent offseason, and it may not look like it's too much to call home about, but it's more or less just kind of a look at how the rebuild is progressing.
Yeah, look, it wasn't going to be a perfect offseason for the Flyers given the positions of need, and that they were going to be doing it more on the fly as prospects perform over camp, more than with surefire answers. So, that being said, I like the position they are in to potentially use this season as a big transition year from a lot of aging veterans and bottom six players to an injection of youth. I think without going too far into grading it and things like that, I think the one thing that says it all about this team and the state of the team is what came out this week and the event that they're going to have before the camp really gets off and running, and that's the rookie game is going to happen on September 13th. And the roster for that game is also out. And then you go down the roster and you see Morgan Frost and Oscar Lindblom and Nolan Patrick and Isaac Ratcliffe and Yerman Rubtsov and Matthew Strome and Mikhail Vorobyov and things like that. And you go, that's just the forward group. Then you go to the defensemen and you go Sam Moran, Phil Myers, Travis Sanheim, goalies are Alex Lyon and Carter Hart, and you're going, no wonder people want to see, and the reaction, that's the thing. The fact that they were out of tickets, at least the ticket limit that they had for it, in less than 4 hours, people who are fans of this team are so excited about the prospects and what they could bring to the team down the road that they will just go on a random Wednesday night in September to go watch them play a game that's virtually meaningless. And I get it. Free tickets, that's, you're not exactly saying, here, pay up to go watch the kids play. But at the same time, that's essentially your first chance to get any look at them besides development camp. People are flocking to those things because they want to see these players. That's what they want to see. And that's why I think the position of being in a transition year, getting some of these players into the NHL sooner rather than later, makes a difference. So if I had to put a letter grade on it, I would have said a B, because the draft was outstanding. Internal moves, for the most part, were pretty good. The re-signing of Gostisbehere, like we talked about, I thought was a great move and very cost-effective. The Wheel signing, things like that, they were very cost-effective moves. I thought they did a good job handling the players that they already had. The free agency, and the trade of Shen for Laterra, the first-round picks are nice, but that kind of this for that kind of thing wasn't a good deal. And same thing, the Brian Elliott contract, solid. I don't think they got any worse off than they did when they had Steve Mason. That being said, there was certainly not an improvement either. That's the thing. I don't think they got any worse than Steve Mason, Michael Neuvert tandem, but it's still a tandem, and it's still a goalie who lets in soft goals, and as Dan said, sometimes has trouble stopping the harder ones too, obviously. But that's the point. The point is that you're eventually going to try to get to the top prospect goalie. You're working on the defenseman right now, essentially. You open up 2 more spots, and you already have 2 young ones already up in the NHL. The forward group is quickly following because of the fact that they restocked it so well over the last 2 years of the draft that now it's starting to follow, and you're starting to see where these players fit into the picture. So overall, it's not going to make the team better next year, but it will make them a lot better down the stretch, and that's the right direction to be going. That we've talked about it several times before. The long-term picture is the big picture. Anything short-term, you have to take it with a grain of salt because of the fact that it's something that is designed for the short term. It's not designed to go much further than beyond this upcoming season. So, long-term, I still think they kept the big picture right where it has been for the last several years, and they're getting a lot closer to starting to see that big picture come to fruition.
Well, the thing with the rookie game, Kevin, is that's like the only thing to look forward to. When you get to see these players, you've heard so much about these players, you want to see them finally. It's hard to not want to go see them when the product on the ice that you've seen last season and the season before that, even though they made the playoffs, it wasn't a great product. And the season before that, essentially this whole stretch, and then the potentiality that this next season will be bad. You need to escape from your own team. You need to escape to the future that you hope is going to happen. If this rebuild doesn't work out, it's not going to go out over well. Like there's no reason to believe it won't go over well, but this is a lot of years of accepting mediocrity in the short term in the hopes that these guys will turn into the players that they've been touted, that fans hope, that the Flyers hope themselves. So when you look at things in the short term, this is not a great team, but absolutely you look in the long term, but the long term is always a gamble. Things can always go wrong. So just looking in terms of this season, I don't know how I don't know how you make these in March and April. How do you make these fans go back and be like, all right, it's going to be better next season. It's going to be better next season. And how much rope do you have to keep saying that until, you gotta show up. You gotta give them what they want.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of go with your point, Dan, because I see what you're saying, and I don't think that room is there anymore with the players that we call the core, with your Claude Giroux, Wayne Simmons, and Jake Voracek. It's got to start happening, or they're not going to be around to be a part of what people want the future of this team to be. But I think that the way that you keep people involved and interested in even let's go earlier than just March and April, let's even say February, because there's teams that can be out of it then too, is by having that youth injection and seeing those players progress. That's why, like I said, in commenting on the Wheel signing, bringing him back, and again, yeah, he was a restricted free agent, so it's not like there was an a crazy amount of concern in getting something done. I mean, eventually there was a point where it would have had to come to a head, but the bottom line is, by re-signing him, you just brought back one of the players who, to me, was one of the more enjoyable players to watch down the stretch because he actually gave you something, and that's what I think people would hope to see from Lindblom and from, if Nolan Patrick makes the team, you instantly get something. And if they can do, and same thing with second and third year players with Ivan Provorov, Travis Konechny, Shane Gostisbehere, all of those guys. If you can get something from those guys too, I think, first of all, you hope that it makes those core players better, that it makes a Claude Giroux better, and it makes a Wayne Simmons better, and it makes a Jake Voracek better. And at the same time, you have to hope that those players are pitching in enough to make them seem somewhat competitive. I don't view the Flyers as any worse off than they were a year ago either. That's the thing. I really don't. I know we don't want to be talking about being stuck in mediocrity, and that's probably what they are right now. Definitely going into next year. But at the same time, you have to be mindful of the fact that if kids are performing and helping the core out, then something's going to have to give. They're going to have to be a little bit better. They're going to have to be a little bit closer to a playoff team if that all comes together. Obviously, a lot's got to happen for it to all come together, but there's a way that it can all come together. That's why it's hard to predict where they're going to go, and that's why we can't talk about filling team needs or completely evaluating the offseason and saying they're better or worse off than they were a year ago. We don't know until we know who makes the roster. And that's the thing, to your point about the rookie game. That's your first chance to see these kids, and it's your first chance to see them in a game setting. Take the drills out of the picture, just play. And let's see what they look like in that situation. And then not only that, but it sets the tone for camp to come. You're going to, at that point in time, that rookie game is essentially the final happening of rookie camp, and then training camp begins and it's off and running as pretty much the weekend right after with preseason games. So you're going to get exposure to these kids, and the question just is, where does everybody end up? Do they go back anywhere? Do they make a team? Things like that. So to me, that's the answer to keeping it interesting, is if you really believe in these kids enough to give them spots this year, then the hope is that, unfortunately, if it's not another playoff year, which, looking at this division, it's hard to say that it figures to be. You'd really have to have a lot go right for it to be a playoff year. So you hope that they're at least trending upward, meaning the kids' play is, so that when you get to March and April, you're going, I still want to watch these players more than maybe this team, and know that there's parts of this team that are, again, the dead weight that's going to start to be shed off of this team.
I agree with you. It's just there's a reactionary arm to the fan base that, it could be November, it could be December, it could be February, that they know this team is in transition. They know this team is probably not going to make the playoffs, and they will still not be happy. They will still be calling for jobs, still be calling for people to be traded, calling for this and that. And I don't know how long you can keep those fires down until they have to become a reality. And I hope that it doesn't interfere with the long-term plan, because in my eyes, at least, it's a good long-term plan. It's one of the first long-term plans the organization has pretty much ever done. But this is not a patient city. It is not a patient fan base. It's not a patient sport. So it's just how long will Philadelphia Flyers fans essentially put up with not being good, not being the playoff team that they were, they've come to expect in the 90s and the 2000s. And at one point, do they say, we're tired of this?
Yeah, it's a good point, too, because the thing is with this fan base, hope springs eternal, and October 4th is going to come around, and no matter what we've talked about over the course of the last few months and everything that's being said and all the expectations, if you bring in a team that has Nolan Patrick, Oscar Lindblom, Travis Sanheim, and I'm just throwing out names at this point. We don't know exactly who it's going to be, but if let's just say that you do have two forwards and two defensemen who are rookies, not to mention Provorov, Konechny, Gostisbehere, all of that, and you have all of that, there are people in this fan base that will think that's a better team than last year, so they have a shot, things like that. And if it doesn't start off strong in October and November, then the sky is going to be falling again. It's the way that it's the reactionary crutch that the fan base uses, so to speak, where it's, if they're not in position, and you know what, call it. I'll call it as I see it. Flyers fans have, with playoff appearances at least, Flyers fans have been spoiled to a sense, because the team rarely missed the playoffs for so many years between, the right around, like we said, was that late 80s, early 90s part where the Flyers were not a very good team at all. Then the Legion of Doom comes into the picture, things like that, and it's a great team, and it's a team that's consistently making the playoffs every year for the next 15 years, with the exception of one bad year in there, and then this little stretch is hit, and now it's trying to climb out of that. And again, like you said, the first real long-term plan we've ever seen the organization use in quite some time. So, yeah, all that factors in, and it's tough to deal with. I don't know how much longer people are going to be able to take it, quite honestly, but I think you put enough kids into the picture this year, it does make it a little easier to take. Then go outside of that, if we get to year 4 of Dave Haxtell, head coach, and Hextall preaching about the patience and waiting for the kids to come up, and that's what the whole plan is, I don't think that that's something the fan base is going to take very well. if the year after is another year like this. I think people can tolerate it now because they've shown a dedication and a commitment to opening up roster spots. But beyond that, you've got to hit the ground running pretty quickly and start to show that the kids have something in them, because this is what everybody's been waiting for. That's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are off next week with Labor Day upon us, so we'll be back with a new episode in 2 weeks. You can catch it up on the website on Friday, September 8th, with just 9 days until the Flyers' first preseason game. And by that point, rookie camp will probably just have been getting started. By that point, that rookie game will be less than a week away by that point. So a lot will be happening, and that's where we'll pick things up again. So once again, thanks for listening. For Rob Riches and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com.
This has been another edition of the Flyerdelphia Podcast with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning, presented by SportsTalkPhilly.com.